Every witch and wizard who has ever tipped their head back in the Great Hall has seen sky where there ought to be stone. Almost none have stopped to ask how it came to be there. This is the story of the one night it was made. Godric Gryffindor stood on the highest course of the western wall, one hand wrapped around a rope of plaited unicorn hair. Below him, the great hall lay open to the heavens, its four walls newly joined, its floor still pale with the dust of chisels. Timber scaffolds crossed the vast emptiness from end to end and trembled whenever the builders shifted their weight. Overhead, the stars had begun to gather into an order he had never seen before. Bright points drawing nearer to one another without ever seeming to travel. From the floor, Rowena Ravenclaw called up that it had started, and even her measured voice carried soft through all that space. He came down by the inner ladder, boots striking raw oak rungs that only the hands of masons had polished. What stood around them was scarcely a castle yet. Towers rose without roofs. Corridors ended in sheer cliffs of stone. Doorways opened onto nothing but wind and dark. Lamps burned in iron brackets along the walls, though their flames looked dimmer than they had an hour before, for Celestia was lifting its own light over the mountains, and every mortal flame bowed before it. At the floor, Godric found the other three founders, waiting beneath the center of the unfinished ceiling. Rowena had spread a sheet of dark blue silk across a long trestle table and pinned its corners with lumps of quartz. On it lay brass compasses, glass rods, bowls of powdered pearl, and a silver astrolabe whose rings turned without being touched. Beside a copper cauldron, Helga Hufflepuff stirred a liquid so white it threw its shadows upward. Salazar Slytherin knelt with both palms pressed flat to the flagstones, listening through the stone as though it held a buried voice. Not one of them was dressed for splendor. Their robes were patched with lime dust, their sleeves rolled to the elbow, their hands marked by the long labor of raising walls. Salazar opened his eyes. "The eastern foundations are holding," he said. "The northern buttress is still settling. If the light pulls against it, we lose 3 courses of stone." "Then it must not pull." Rowena nudged one of the astrolabe's rings over by the width of a fingernail and watched the stars turn in its polished face. "The alignment reaches its first crossing before midnight. We take only the outer threads to begin with." Godric looked up through the roofless hall. He knew the constellation above him piece by piece, yet the pattern joining those pieces had changed. Stars that belonged to different seasons shone together now, linked by faint lines like frost creeping across glass, and beyond them lay a depth so clear and black the eye could scarcely bear it. He had seen enchanted skies in old Roman chambers, weather charms spread over royal courts, but those had been painted imitations, obedient things made to resemble heaven. Celestia offered no resemblance. It offered the sky itself. Helga lifted her spoon from the cauldron and let the white liquid fall back in a shining ribbon. Moon milk was ready, she told them. 3 measures of crystal salt, 1 of ground opal, and the last snow from Ben Nevis. "The last snow?" Godric asked. "The last that had never felt summer." She touched the surface with 1 finger, and the liquid climbed her hand in a thin, luminous thread before settling again. Living light dislikes being held. This may persuade it. We are offering rest. Salazar rose, brushing stone grit from his knees. His dark hair had come loose at the nape. A shallow cut crossed one knuckle where the mortar had bitten him earlier that day. "Stone does not persuade," he said. "Stone endures. I have opened 12 channels through the walls and bound them to the foundations. Whatever enters the ceiling will have somewhere to set its weight." "Light has no weight," Rowena murmured, still watching the astrolabe. "This light does." Something passed over the open hall then, too delicate for wind and too steady for song. The silver instruments on the table began to hum in answer, each at its own pitch, and the rope in Godric's hand grew cold, though it had hung beside the brazier since sunset. Tiny sparks gathered along its fibers, blue-white and sharp as grains of salt. When he raised it, they slid down towards his fingers, testing the warmth of his skin. The smell came next, clean and piercing, like snow split open by an axe, and under it something that put him in mind of iron left too long beneath pine trees. Helga drew a slow breath and turned her face up. Rowena's hand stopped above the astrolabe. Even Salazar, who trusted stone far more readily than sky, stepped clear of the wall's shadow. Across the highest darkness, the first bridge of Celestia appeared. It did not blaze. It unfolded. A narrow river of pale radiance joining one star to the next and the next, until the heavens seemed webbed all over with living silver. The lines moved with the quiet purpose of roots working through earth, crossing and dividing in patterns beyond any chart Rowena had ever drawn. One thread bent towards the great hall, thinner than spun glass, brighter than a sword's edge at noon, and came down without haste to touch the air above the unfinished walls. Every loose fragment of stone lifted from the floor. Dust rose in soft spirals around the founder's boots. Chips of granite turned slowly in the air, each holding its own minute reflection of the stars. The scaffolding ropes pulled taut with no hand on them, and the copper cauldron rang as if struck by a bell somewhere far off. Godric tightened his grip on the unicorn hair line, while the first strand of living starlight hovered above them, curious and untamed. "Outer thread," Rowena said quietly. "No more than that." Godric stepped beneath it and raised the rope. The light shied back before he could touch it, curling upward like a creature woken from sleep, then swept sideways across the hall with such sudden grace that the lamps guttered in its wake. One suspended stone flashed white, cracked cleanly in two, and fell. And Salazar moved his hand, and the flagstone beneath it softened for an instant to take the fragments without a sound. Helga dipped both hands into the moon milk. Pale liquid streamed from her fingers as she lifted them towards the strand. "Do not seize it," she said. "Let it find the cooler path." The starlight paused. For one breath it leaned towards her open palms, trembling above the white radiance that coated them. Godric lowered the rope an inch. Rowena turned a single ring of the astrolabe, and the humming instruments found one clear note between them. And Salazar laid his hand against the nearest pillar, opening the hidden channels in the stone. Then the living thread came down into the hall. It touched Helga's hands and divided into 7 finer strands, each one running along the wet shine of moon milk, without sinking in, bright as frost on a window, searching the curves of her fingers. Her breath caught, though she held still, A white line traveled over her wrist and vanished beneath her sleeve, leaving the wool untouched while the skin below glowed faintly blue. "It is colder than winter," she whispered, "and it knows I am warm." Godric kept the unicorn hair rope lowered between them, offering it as a bridge and not a snare. One strand rose from Helga's palm and settled on the plaited fibers, and the rope bent beneath it. Salazar had been right. This light had weight, though it was a strange, patient weight like deep water resting against a dam. Godric felt it travel into his shoulder and down through his boots until the flagstones answered with a low pulse. "Hold where you are." Rowena stood over the astrolabe with both hands poised above its spinning rings. The thread is still joined to the crossing. Every movement here is carried upward. Above the open walls, the silver bridge trembled from star to star. A faint ripple ran along its length, and the whole sky seemed to draw in breath. Godric fixed his eyes on the nearest channel Salazar had cut into the western pillar, a narrow groove that rose from the floor and branched towards the unfinished arches. "Where do you want it?" he asked. "First junction." Salazar pressed 2 fingers to the stone, and the groove widened by a hair. "Lay it there gently. If it bites, let go." Godric edged 1 foot forwards, and the starlight tightened all at once, hauling the rope upward until his arm was dragged along with it. He shifted his weight. The strand resisted, not out of anger, but with an immense preference for the sky. And for one extraordinary moment he understood how a bird might feel the earth tugging at its bones. Then Helga was beside him. She laid a single moon-white finger against the rope, and the strain went out of it. Together they coaxed the strand towards the pillar. As it drifted past the trestle table, every brass instrument turned to follow. Powdered pearl lifted from an open bowl and hung like mist, and where the starlight passed through that cloud, it gathered each grain and dressed it in a soft halo. Rowena made a small sound of wonder before she mastered it. "Pearl remembers the moon," she said. "I had hoped it might." At the first junction, Salazar opened the stone. The groove neither split nor cracked. It unfolded, showing a dark inner seam that ran through the pillar like a vein through living flesh. Godric lowered the rope until the captured strand lay across that darkness. Nothing for an instant. Then the light went into the stone with a hiss, like rain on hot iron, and the whole western wall shone from within. Mortar lines blazed silver between the blocks. Along the capitals, carved leaves stirred, though the masons had not yet finished their stems. And beneath the arch, a row of unfinished faces opened smooth stone eyes. Far above, the strand threaded through hidden channels towards the first span of ceiling raised on the eastern side, where it emerged as a narrow band of night blue radiance trembling under the raw timber supports. His palm still flat against the pillar, Salazar spoke in the quiet tone he kept for serpents and wounded creatures. "The stone has taken it," he said. "It is searching." Rowena lifted her gaze to the glowing span. "It must be given a pattern before it makes one of its own." She chose a glass rod from the table and held it beneath the band of light. Tiny marks had been etched along its length, angles, circles, old numerals drawn from Greek and Arabic charts. And as she turned the rod, the starlight above answered, spreading into a thin sheet no wider than a cloak. Within that sheet appeared a piece of sky. 3 stars, and the darkness around them rendered with such depth that the eye seemed able to fall clean through the unfinished roof. 1 star burned steady and gold. Another pulsed pale blue, sending rings across the surface, while the third lay almost hidden behind a drifting thread of cloud, though the true heavens overhead stayed perfectly clear. Her luminous hands forgotten at her sides, Helga stepped nearer. That cloud is over the western sea. I saw it at sunset, beyond the islands. Rowena's glass rod dipped by a fraction. Then the light is not merely carrying what hangs above us, she said, her eyes tracking the slow movement within the silver sheet. It remembers the whole sky. Godric looked from the small living firmament to the vast darkness overhead. The marvel they had imagined was a ceiling that copied the heavens above the castle. What now hovered beneath the beams was something wider, stranger, and far less obedient. Somewhere inside that scrap of captured night, weather was moving over distant waters, unseen by any soul standing in the highlands. Then the blue star flared. The sheet of sky snapped open like a sail struck by wind, and light rushed along the eastern beams, spilling over timber and stone in branching streams. A ladder lifted from the scaffolding and turned slowly towards the roofless height. 3 buckets of mortar rose after it in solemn procession. Godric caught the ladder with the unicorn rope before it cleared the wall, but the buckets tipped, and pale globes of wet mortar went drifting among the stars reflected in the hall. "Close the junction," Rowena called. Salazar struck the pillar with the flat of his hand. The inner seam narrowed too late. The starlight had already crossed beyond it, racing through channels no one had opened. Silver lines spread over the eastern wall, slipped beneath the floor, and burst upwards in a ring around Helga's cauldron. The moon milk climbed in one smooth column, carrying the copper vessel with it. She reached for the cauldron and missed. It floated beyond her fingers, turning slowly, while the liquid inside crept towards its rim. "Godric," she said with a calmness that plainly cost her, "the sky appears to be stealing my supper pot." He cast the rope upwards. The loop went round one copper handle, tightened, and drew the cauldron down before the moon milk could escape. In the same breath, Rowena reversed the astrolabe's central ring, forcing its silver bands against their natural motion, and the note filling the great hall deepened until the runaway streams hesitated. Salazar drove both hands against the floor. Stone answered stone, every hidden channel shut in sequence, beginning at the foundations and rising through the pillars in a chain of muffled knocks, and the wandering light folded back on itself, withdrawing from the beams, the walls, the trembling scaffolds. Loose tools came down to the floor. The ladder settled across Godric's shoulder. The 3 globes of mortar dropped neatly into Helga's waiting cauldron. Only the first narrow band held on beneath the eastern span, keeping its 3 stars and its distant cloud. Its edges wavered as though weighing escape, then went still. Around it the raw hall darkened once more, though silver lingered in every grain of dust. Rowena let go of the astrolabe and stared up at their small piece of living night. "One outer thread," she said softly, "and already it has found 12 ways to disobey us." Godric lowered the rescued ladder and set it down with some care. Above them, The gold star brightened through the fragment of sky, and its reflection crossed all 4 faces in turn. Then we shall have to learn 12 new ways of asking, Helga said. That first fragment of sky stayed suspended beneath the eastern span while Rowena walked its length with the glass rod raised. Each careful turn of her wrist altered the shape of the silver edge, drawing it nearer to the beams without ever letting it touch. The gold star within went on burning over some distant horizon, and the cloud beside it thinned into pale veils. Beneath that moving darkness, fresh-cut oak took on the color of midnight. It dislikes corners, she said. Every time I give it an angle, it tries to unfold. Then the ceiling must teach it curves. Helga had strained the mortar from her moon milk and was stirring the mixture back towards stillness. The fall had left silver droplets clinging to the cauldron's rim, each reflecting a different constellation, and when she brushed them together with her thumb, they rang like tiny bells. We were making a roof for men. Perhaps we ought to remember what it is meant to carry. Salazar crossed to the nearest scaffold support and laid his hand on the timber. The beam shuddered under his palm, shedding curls of bark that had slipped past the carpenter's knife. The stone arches can be softened, not weakened, persuaded into a gentler rise. His gaze traveled across the unfinished hall, measuring distances no chart displayed. But if we change the curve now, the western courses must follow. Godric turned towards the open western wall, where several masons' platforms stood empty against the stars. By sunrise, the unfinished courses would still be unfinished. No one had reckoned on living light demanding changes in the masonry. He wound the unicorn rope round his forearm and studied the narrow patch overhead. We can raise the western ribs with magic. Only for tonight. The builders may curse us tomorrow. They already do, Salazar said, though his attention stayed on the beam. Your tower staircase has moved 3 times this week. It was searching for the best view. Rowena lowered the glass rod and looked from one of them to the other until the hall went quiet again. Then she set the rod aside and drew a piece of charcoal across the blue silk. Her first line followed the roof they had planned, a high central ridge descending in straight, noble planes. Over it she drew a second shape, a shallow vault, whose ribs spread from the pillars like branches from 4 ancient trees. The fragment of sky rippled above her as the curve appeared, and they all saw it. The light is reading the drawing, Helga whispered. Rowena moved the charcoal again, extending the vault across the width of the hall and letting each rib divide before it reached the center. Overhead, the silver edge widened in answer, flowing into a soft arc between 2 beams. The gold star drifted with it and settled higher. The blue star sank towards the eastern wall. A faint seam of cloud crossed the new curve and ran on past the captured fragment as though the rest of the invisible sky waited to be admitted. Salazar took up a mason's mallet and began giving orders. Godric to the western scaffold, Helga to keep the light cool, and Rowena, give me the true line. They climbed into the unfinished height. From the upper platform, the great hall was less a chamber than the hollow inside some enormous instrument. Pillars rose out of the darkness below. Ropes stretched from wall to wall, and the first piece of sky floated close enough now for Godric to see that its blackness was full of colors too deep to notice from the ground. Violet gathered around the blue star. Green shimmered faintly beneath the cloud, and along the silver edge sparks crawled like small bright insects seeking cracks in the world. Rowena took the eastern scaffold, the charcoal design fastened before her. Her wand traced the first revised curve through the air and left a thin blue line from pillar to pillar. Below it, Salazar struck the stone once. The sound traveled through the wall, and the upper courses began to move. Blocks weighing more than horses eased from their beds of mortar, turning slowly, shedding dust into the hall, then settling into the new arc with deep, measured groans. Godric braced the western scaffold as the shifting weight pulled against its ropes. Timber bent beneath his boots, and somewhere below, a wooden pin cracked sharply. "Left support," he called. Helga raised both hands from the floor, and moon milk streamed upwards in 2 white ribbons, wrapping itself around the failing joint. The broken pin slipped free, but the luminous bands held the scaffold together while Godric drove a spare length of oak through the gap. Cold passed through the timber into his fingers, sharp enough to numb the knuckles. Once the joint steadied, the moon milk withdrew and fell back into Helga's bowl without spilling a drop. Salazar struck the wall a second time. The next run of stone rose too quickly, 3 blocks twisting beyond Rowena's line, drawn towards the starlight rather than the arch. Their lower edges scraped across one another and scattered sparks and chips into the dark. Godric threw the unicorn rope around the nearest block and leaned back with all his weight, boots sliding along the plank. "Do not fight the pull," Rowena said from across the void. "Turn it with the curve." He loosened the rope before instinct could make him tighten it. The block surged upwards, almost tearing the line from his hands. But he stepped sideways and let its motion swing rather than stop, and it traveled in a slow half-circle through the air. Salazar opened a fresh bed in the wall, and the stone settled into place with a heavy sigh. The other 2 followed. For the next hour they worked from rib to rib, revising the shape of the hall while the heavens changed above them. Rowena drew each curve only when the fragment of sky answered. Salazar moved stone through stone, giving the new vault strength before beauty. Helga climbed between platforms, with bowls of moon milk balanced along her arms, cooling beams that smoked beneath the touch of stray sparks. Godric carried, caught, steadied, and released, and learned that the greatest force was most often needed only to keep himself from using it. Near the center of the hall, the first 4 ribs approached one another but did not meet. A round darkness stayed open between them, open to the true sky, and through it Celestia's silver bridges had grown broader, their crossings bright enough to throw shadows across the mountains. The living fragment beneath the eastern span lifted towards that opening, stretching as though it recognized a path home. Rowena watched it rise. "We should take the second thread now." Godric rested one hand against the newly curved stone. It hummed beneath his palm, no longer resisting the sky's strange weight. Far below, Helga was preparing fresh moon milk, while Salazar opened the channels through the foundations one by one, and above them another line of Celestia bent down towards the castle, wider and brighter than the first. This time, the great hall reached upwards to receive it. The second thread descended through the round opening, at the center of the vault and touched nothing at first. It hung between the ribs, like a plumb line dropped from the highest dark, perfectly straight, its lower end stopping a man's height above the floor. Beneath it, the stone channels began to sing, their voices rising from the foundations in slow, overlapping tones. Godric felt the sound through the scaffold before he heard it. "It is heavier," he said. Salazar stood below, with both arms spread, a hand resting against each central pillar. "The castle feels it already." Fine dust sifted from the joints around him, though no stone moved. "Do not bring it lower until the western channels are open." Rowena watched the astrolabe turn. Its outer rings followed Celestia, but the innermost circle had begun to spin against them, tracing the movement of the captured fragment beneath the eastern vault. She adjusted a silver pin, waited for the two motions to cross, then lifted her glass rod. Now. Godric cast the unicorn hair rope over the descending light. The loop closed, but the thread passed straight through it. Cold burst along the rope and ran into his arm with force enough to lock his elbow. For an instant, the stars overhead seemed to sharpen, every point of light cutting cleanly through the dark, and he smelled iron, snow, and something green crushed beneath frost. Then the strand turned inside the loop and wound itself around the rope of its own accord. Its weight came all at once. The scaffold bowed. Godric dropped to one knee, the rope burning white across his palms while the central beam groaned beneath him. Below, Helga overturned a bowl of moon milk across the floor. The liquid spread in a bright circle and climbed the pillars in branching lines, cooling the strain where stone met timber. "Give it down," Salazar called, and Godric let the rope slide. The thread descended by inches, each movement sending a slow tremor through the vault. As it passed the eastern fragment, the 3 stars within that small patch of sky brightened in answer. The cloud over the distant sea turned silver at its edge, and a second cloud appeared beyond it, darker and swollen with rain. Rowena's face tilted towards the moving weather. "It is joining," she said. "The first piece recognizes the greater current." Helga stepped inside the circle of moon milk and raised both hands. The white liquid climbed her sleeves, ran over her shoulders, and gathered above her head in a shallow bowl held together by charm and will. Into it Godric lowered the starlight, and the moment the thread touched the surface, the entire basin flashed clear. For one breath, they looked down through it instead of up. Beneath Helga's suspended hands lay a depth of stars, vast and cold, as though the floor had opened into midnight. Far below those stars, a pale shape drifted across the darkness with the slow grace of a cloud seen from the other side. Helga's fingers trembled under the weight. "It does not wish to rest," she said. "It wishes to continue." "Then let it," Rowena replied. She swept the glass rod towards the western rib. Salazar opened the first channel, and the thread surged from Helga's basin in a silver arc, struck the stone, entered, and reappeared 3 yards farther along as a broad ribbon of night. Godric moved with it across the scaffold, feeding the rope through his hands while Rowena guided its direction from below. The new sky spread more quickly than the first. Darkness flowed beneath the vault, deep blue at its edges and black towards the center, carrying stars that had not yet risen over Hogwarts. Some burned close and fierce. Others seemed buried in distances so great that their light barely reached the stone. The ribbon crossed the first fragment without leaving a seam, and the tiny patch of distant weather widened into a sweep of sea, cloud, and moonless horizon. Where the two captured threads met, a loose spark escaped. It darted from the ceiling and struck the upper scaffold, and oak blossomed beneath it. Within seconds, pale branches pushed from the timber, leafless and luminous, growing out over the hall in a tangle of shining twigs. Godric ducked as one swept past his head and wrapped around the unicorn rope. The living branch pulled. His feet left the plank. For a moment he hung above the hall with the rope clamped between both hands, the new-grown bough bending towards the unfinished ceiling. A ribbon of moon milk rose from Helga's hands, but the branch flinched away and split itself into 3 finer limbs, each one reaching towards the captured stars as though it hoped for a place among them. "Do not cut it," Rowena called. She was turning the astrolabe, aligning its rings with the branch's spread. "It is following a constellation." Salazar peered up through the silver limbs and asked which one. "None that exists yet," she told him. Rather than tear the rope free, Godric swung a boot at the scaffold, caught the edge, and hauled himself level before easing the strand loose from the wood. The luminous branch relaxed at once. Its 3 limbs climbed into the darkened vault, brushed the spreading sky, and dissolved into lines of stars. A new figure came out across the ceiling. Something like a great tree standing upon the curve of the heavens, its roots sunk among dim red lights, and its crown scattered with blue-white fire. No chart held it, no traveler had ever named it, and yet the shape looked ancient, as though it had waited somewhere out of sight for the hall to make room. Beneath it, the 4 of them stood quite still. Then the second thread gave a sudden, eager pull towards the opening above. Godric tightened his hands. Rowena raised the glass rod. Helga steadied the basin of moon milk, and Salazar opened the next hidden channel, and the living sky moved on beneath the stone, carrying its nameless constellation westward. By the time that second thread reached the western ribs, half the great hall lay beneath living night. Above the scaffolds, the boundary between enchantment and open air ran in a wavering line, bright at its edge and dark behind, as though evening itself were being drawn slowly across the stone. Godric moved beneath it with the unicorn hair rope looped twice around his forearm. When the sky pulled upwards, the muscles across his shoulders tightened. When it settled again, the rope went soft as ordinary cord in his grip. He had learned to know the moments before each change by the taste of cold metal at the back of his tongue. On the central platform, Rowena stood, surrounded by charts that no longer agreed with one another. Some showed the stars above Hogwarts, others the wandering lights caught in the ceiling overhead, and one had filled itself with marks no human hand had drawn, the ink crawling slowly across the parchment, making circles within circles before it faded at the edges. "The pattern is altering as we lay it," she said. "Every piece changes the way the next one arrives." At the western pillar, where silver had gathered under the stone like water beneath ice, Salazar pressed his thumb into the mortar joint. A faint crack of light traveled down towards the foundations. "The channels were too narrow here," he said. "Force another span through them and the wall would split from within." Helga was carrying a shallow clay basin along the scaffold, the moon milk trembling with every step. It had grown clearer since the work began. Stars appeared in it now before ever they reached the ceiling, small reflections waiting in the white depths. She knelt beside Salazar and dipped 2 fingers into the basin, then widened the path. The light follows what yields. Stone that yields too far becomes rubble, only if it forgets its shape. He watched her hand against the pillar. Moon milk seeped into the joint and spread through the rock in thin white roots, and there were the hidden channels laid bare, their rigid cuts running straight from foundation to rib, practical, strong, and each one ending sharply where the ceiling began to curve. Helga traced a gentler route around them, winding through the stone instead of crossing it. There, let it climb as water climbs through a tree. For a long moment Salazar did nothing at all. Then he set his palm over hers. The western wall answered with a deep shifting sound. Inside the stone, the straight channels softened and bent and joined one another in slow spirals. The blocks settled closer together as the new paths opened, and the silver pressure beneath them began to spread. Godric felt the pull on his rope ease until he could stand upright once more. Rowena lifted the astrolabe and told him to bring the thread across. He walked backwards along the scaffold, guiding the living strand towards the altered wall. Its light had thickened around the rope, coating every fiber in white fire, and where it passed close to the captured ceiling, the sky bent low to meet it. Clouds gathered along the edge, their undersides violet, their crowns lit by stars. Without a sound, the thread entered the western pillar. For several breaths, nothing followed. Then the stone began to shine in rings, each one rising above the last, the light traveling through Helga's winding channels, circling the pillar as ivy circles an old tree until it came out beneath the vault in 7 slender streams. They did not spread flat across the ceiling. They curved towards one another instead, weaving a braided band of darkness and stars. Godric stared up as the strands crossed. "It is making its own rib." "A rib of sky," Rowena said. From the western wall to the central opening, the braided light reached and held there, suspended with neither timber nor stone beneath it. Stars gathered along its length in bright knots, and between them moved a darkness so deep that the unfinished beams looked pale by comparison. Salazar struck the pillar with the heel of his hand. The new span gave a low, resonant note and did not move. Helga laid her fingers to the silvered timber beside her. "The castle accepts it," she said. Then another sound answered from overhead. It began as a faint chiming near the eastern vault where the first fragment had been laid. One star within that older piece flickered and divided into a cluster of tiny lights, and the cluster loosened from the ceiling and came drifting down through the hall like glowing seeds. Godric reached for the rope, but Rowena raised a hand and told him to wait. Down among the scaffolds, the little lights descended, slow and curious. One settled on the rim of Helga's basin and turned the moon milk gold. Another rested against Salazar's sleeve, leaving no mark but a narrow trail of frost. 3 gathered about Rowena's astrolabe and began to circle its outer ring. the wrong way round. The last light came to Godric. It hovered before his face, no larger than an ember, and up close it was not a point at all, but a tiny window into a vast, moving dark. Inside it, a pale star wheeled around something unseen, and beyond that another light flashed once and was gone. He held still until the spark drifted down and touched the rope. The unicorn hair came alive in his hands. Every strand unplaited at once and spread across the hall in hundreds of silver filaments. They rose from his grip like the strings of an enormous harp, some fastening themselves to the stone ribs, others to the living band of sky, and before he could close his fingers, the escaping spark raced along one filament towards the central opening. Godric. Rowena's voice had gone suddenly sharp. He seized the nearest strands. The rest drew tight across the great hall, humming under the weight of the captured heavens. A single filament snapped near the eastern scaffold, then another, each break loosing a burst of cold white flame that left the timber smoking. The small wandering star reached the open center and flared. All at once the living ceiling pulled towards it. Clouds stretched thin, stars slid from their places, and the braided western span bent upwards like a bow. Stone groaned along every wall. Salazar braced both hands against the pillar. Helga overturned her basin across the scaffold to cool the burning ropes, and Rowena thrust the glass rod into the heart of the astrolabe to keep its rings from spinning apart. Godric wrapped both arms around the scattered filaments. The force lifted him clear of the platform and dragged him towards the opening above. His boots struck the edge of a beam and splintered the wood, but he held on. And through the widening circle of night, he saw Celestia turning overhead, its silver bridges crossing one another in immense and silent beauty. The little star waited at their heart, calling the stolen sky home. Godric rose until his shoulders met the lower edge of the central opening. Beneath him, the scattered unicorn filaments cut white lines across the hall, each drawn taut between his hands, and some distant point in the unfinished vault. Through the circle above, Celestia hung close enough to step into, its silver crossings laid across the true night-like paths thrown down over deep water, and at their center the little star hovered, drawing every captured fragment towards itself. Cold burned through his palms, clean and fierce. The smell of pine sharpened until the raw timber around him might have been a whole winter forest. "Do not drag against it," Rowena called from below, both hands locked around the arrested rings of the astrolabe as the instrument strained under her grip. "You cannot hold a road by standing in its path." Godric worked one arm through the filaments and looked down. Far beneath his boots, the great hall had become a web of silver lines and broken shadows, and along the central scaffold, Helga moved, pouring moon milk over each smoking junction before the timber could catch. Between the western pillars, Salazar stood with his head bowed, the stone around his hands glowing through its mortar seams. Not one of them could reach the spark above him. "What does it want?" Godric asked. A bright ribbon of moon milk climbed from Helga's basin and wrapped the nearest strained filament. "To rejoin what it knows," she answered. "You would pull towards home as well." The little star pulsed once and the ceiling answered, Over the eastern ribs, the fragment tore loose along one edge with a sound like silk parting underwater. Clouds folded in upon themselves, stars slid towards the central opening, and the nameless tree constellation bent until its crown pointed upwards. Stone ribs groaned beneath the changing pressure. A carved capital split across the middle and showered Salazar with chips of granite. He did not flinch. The western wall will not hold another pull. Then close it, Godric said. If I close the channels now, the light trapped inside them will shatter the stone. Rowena looked from the ascending spark to the ceiling it was drawing after it. Where her hands held the astrolabe's outer rings still, the metal had begun to glow red. The spark is not the cause, she said. It is the first thing we captured that still remembers the path. Another filament snapped, and Godric's grip tightened as white fire crossed his wrist and left a narrow burn beneath the leather guard. A path to where? Back through the alignment. Her gaze lifted to the great silver crossings overhead. We've been asking the sky to descend and remain. We have never shown it how remaining might still feel like movement. Helga stepped over a gap in the scaffold and reached the base of the central rib, moon milk dripping from her sleeves and silvering the wood beneath her hands. Can the ceiling be given a current? In answer, Rowena released one ring of the astrolabe. The instrument sprang into motion, brass and silver circles spinning around one another so swiftly that their edges blurred into a sphere of light. The chart spread across the floor lifted in the wind of it, turning pages, folding and unfolding, fresh ink running over their surfaces in broad dark arcs, and Rowena followed the marks as they appeared. Not a current through the stone, she said, a turning within the enchantment. The heavens move, yet the pattern endures, because every light is held by every other. Dust clung to Salazar's hair and shoulders as he raised his face. You propose that we anchor nothing. I propose that we anchor relationships. Another violent pull traveled through the unicorn threads. Godric was lifted halfway through the opening, his chest scraping stone, and above him the little star brightened until its tiny depths vanished inside white flame, while the captured ceiling climbed beneath him in great dark folds. Rowena, he said through his teeth, it would be a kindness if the relationship could be established soon. She seized the glass rod from the table and drew a circle in the air. Salazar, open every channel between the eastern and western foundations. Do not send them upwards, join them beneath the floor. The foundations were never cut for that. Then teach them. Salazar dropped to one knee and pressed both palms against the flagstones. A crack rolled beneath the hall, deep enough to shake dust from the unfinished walls. The floor rippled in broad rings around him, stones lifting and settling as hidden passages formed below, and the silver light that had been trapped in the pillars drained downwards, running through the new channels like water let go from locks. The strain upon the western ribs eased. The pull at the center only grew. Helga, Rowena said, turning the glass rod within her circle, we need darkness that will not reject the light. Helga looked towards the cauldron. Less than a quarter of the moon milk remained, churned gray by mortar dust and fragments of oak. Moon milk cools what enters it. It cannot carry night. What carries a seed before it sees the sun? Helga's hand stilled above the basin. Then she climbed down from the scaffold and crossed to the raw earthen strip along the northern wall, where the flagstones had not yet been laid, and there she knelt and sank both hands into the dark soil. When she rose, her palms held a mound of black earth threaded with pale roots. "A seed is carried by what appears empty," she said, and tipped the soil into the cauldron. Moon milk clouded at once, white folding into brown, brown deepening towards black, though the mixture did not dull. Tiny stars opened within it, visible only when Helga stirred, then vanished again beneath the surface. The scent of cold metal faded from the hall and gave way to wet earth, leaves, and the first breath released when frost loosens from a field. Above the astrolabe, Rowena's circle widened. "Bring it beneath the opening." Helga raised the cauldron with both hands, and its contents rose ahead of her in a dark column, turning slowly as it climbed towards Godric. He felt its coolness before it reached him, gentler than the starlight and deeper than ordinary shadow, and it spread beneath the little star to make a narrow bridge of living darkness from the captured ceiling to the true sky. The spark ceased pulling. For a breath, it hovered above the dark path, trembling between ascent and return, and Godric loosened the filaments in his hands. One by one, all across the hall, they softened, their terrible tension easing into something like music. "Let it choose," Helga said. The little star descended. It touched the bridge of darkness and traveled along it without haste, no longer blazing, no longer calling the ceiling after it. As it passed him, Godric saw its hidden depths again, the pale orbiting light, the darkness beyond, and farther still a faint blue shimmer like dawn seen from another world. It followed the black current down towards the eastern vault, and where it entered the torn fragment, the living sky opened around it. Clouds unfurled. Stars returned to their places, though not quite the places they had held before, and the nameless tree straightened across the vault, its roots now reaching into the braided western band. Beneath the floor, Salazar's joined channels began to pulse in a slow circular rhythm, passing silver pressure from pillar to pillar. The ceiling was turning. Its movement could not be seen in the stone, yet every star drifted by the smallest measure, each carrying the next with it. No longer did the captured sky pull upwards towards Celestia. It moved within itself now, held by a pattern that never became still. Godric lowered through the central opening until his boots found the damaged scaffold, and the unicorn filaments gathered back into his hands, re-braiding themselves strand by strand. Around him, the raw hall settled from its strain. Dust descended. Timber stopped groaning, and somewhere in the walls, the newly opened channels gave a low, contented hum. "We've been building a picture," Rowena said, looking up at the slow-moving ceiling. Overhead, the little star completed its first arc through the living night. "Now," Helga answered, "we are building a sky." The turning began so slowly that only Rowena could follow it. She stood beneath the central opening with the astrolabe held against her breast, watching one pale star cross the width of a carved leaf by less than a grain of barley. Around it, the new sky stayed calm, the dark current beneath the floor, passing from pillar to pillar in measured pulses, each pulse returning through the vault as a low silver resonance. It is holding, she said. Godric sat on the edge of the damaged scaffold, while Helga wound linen soaked in the last of the clear moon milk around his burned wrist. Where the cloth met the narrow white mark, it smoked, then cooled against his skin. Overhead, the ceiling moved with a quiet depth no painted enchantment could ever have held. Cloud had thickened over the western sea, and a faint fall of rain drifted beneath it, fine as threads pulled through blue wool. "How much more sky does it need?" he asked. "All of it," said Rowena. At the cracked capital, Salazar looked up. One side of the carved stone had split clean away, and the unfinished face beneath lay open and pale. "The hall cannot take all of anything. Not all at once." Rowena crossed to the blue silk and drew 12 small circles about the central design, her hand steady. The turning had to be finished in stages, she told them. Each new thread must enter the motion before the next could be drawn down. Helga knotted the linen and set Godric's hand back on his knee. "Then we shall give it time." He was looking up through the open center of the vault. Celestia had drifted westward since the first thread came down, and though the silver bridges still crossed the heavens, their highest meeting had begun to lean away from the castle. Dawn lay far beyond the mountains. The alignment would not wait on the sun. "Time," he said, "is moving with the rest of it." They went back to their places. Thinner than the first two and far less willing to descend, the third thread came curving round the central opening in a veil of sparks before it slipped sideways along the top of the southern wall. Beneath it, every iron nail pulled half an inch from the timber and hung trembling in the air. Salazar raised a hand, and the nails sank home before the scaffolds could loosen. "Too bright at the edge," Rowena said. "It has passed close to a fixed star." Helga lifted a shallow wooden bowl of the darkened moon milk. "Bring it low enough to smell the earth." Godric cast the mended rope above the wall. The loop settled about the Starlight, but the strand pressed itself flat to the stone, spreading and thinning until it was nearly transparent, and through it he saw the rough granite beneath, each grain enlarged and made clear, as though the wall held a mountain in miniature. He drew the rope. The light only clung the tighter. "It has mistaken the stone for night," Rowena said. Salazar laid his palm to the outer face of the wall. "Then the stone must release it." A tremor ran through the mortar. Gray darkened to black, the shine draining out of the granite until the thread stood plain against it once more. Godric pulled gently, and the starlight came free in one long silver sheet, carrying on it the impression of every stone it had touched. For several breaths, a second wall floated above the real one, its blocks made of translucent light and full of stars, the mortar lines shining between them like frozen rivers. Through the whole radiant structure moved the shadow of the mountain the granite had been cut from, roots in high soil, water beneath rock, a dark seam of iron sleeping under snow. Helga stepped nearer. "It remembers what holds it." Then the shining wall began to tilt. Rowena threw both hands up. "Guide it towards the southern rib. Don't let it fold." Godric moved along the scaffold, drawing the sheet after him. It fought every sharp turn, buckling where the rope swung too quickly. Below him, Helga followed, with the bowl raised, letting the scent of damp soil and pale roots rise through the timber, while Salazar walked the line of the southern pillars, opening the winding channels one by one. When the light reached the first rib, it refused the stone. Instead, it spread across the scaffold, flattening over planks and ropes and buckets and the abandoned tools, and every object beneath it stood visible from all sides at once. A mallet showed the rings inside its wooden handle. A mason's chisel gave back the red glow that had lived in the iron before it cooled. Godric looked down and saw the bones of his own hand beneath the bandage, clear and white within the living flesh. He stopped. The sheet climbed his arm. Cold entered at the wrist, past the elbow, reached his shoulder before he could let go of the rope. It did not burn. It searched. The deep grain of old scars, the pulse under his throat, the shape of his own breath inside his chest, and above him the captured sky shivered in answer. "Godric," Helga said. Her voice brought his eyes down. She stood beneath the scaffold with one hand out, the dark bowl balanced in the other, and he lowered the rope towards her. The shining sheet came away from his arm, slow and reluctant, and the hidden workings of his body vanished under skin again. She touched the starlight with 2 fingers, dipped in the earth-dark moon milk, and the sheet contracted around her hand. She made no attempt to command it. She only turned her palm upward and let the light show what lay there: crushed roots, grains of quartz, the empty wing of a beetle, and one seed no larger than a tear. Bright it looked in all that darkness, holding a folded green shape it had not yet made. The starlight gathered to it. The broad shining wall narrowed into branching lines, each one tracing the hidden curve within the seed, and the lines rose from Helga's palm, crossed the scaffold, and entered the southern rib the way roots enter ground. The stone took them without strain. Across the unfinished ceiling, a new pattern spread. It began as a dark field beside the nameless tree constellation. Then faint green-gold lights woke within it. Not stars as the founders knew them, but points set out like leaves before they open. The pattern joined the turning sky and moved with it, carrying the memory of growth up into the cold reaches above. Salazar watched the southern wall settle round the new light. It needed something smaller than itself. "And something it could enter," said Rowena, marking the 3rd circle on her silk, "without being confined." Godric flexed the bandaged hand. The numbness had gone, and a deep ache sat under the burn. Through the central opening, Celestia held to its westward passage, the silver paths drawing away by degrees too small for anyone but Rowena to measure. Along the ceiling, the green-gold constellation began to open. They opened one by one. As the 3rd thread entered the turning, each point unfurling into a shape too delicate to be called a leaf, though leaf was the nearest earthly likeness. Fine veins of radiance spread across the southern vault, joining star to star in quiet branching paths, and where those paths crossed, the darkness deepened rather than brightened, giving the ceiling a depth that ran far past the stone. Helga watched, one hand still cupped around the seed, warm and ordinary now in her palm. Rowena marked the 3rd circle on the blue silk and drew a line from it to the first 2. Under her fingers, the charcoal shifted, correcting its own angle by the smallest degree. "The pattern is learning balance," she said. "Each thread changes the weight of the whole, but the turning carries the change onwards." Salazar stayed by the southern pillar, listening through the stone. The hidden channels pulsed under his hand with a steadier rhythm now. though one beat came late from the north. He crossed the hall and set his ear to the unfinished wall there. "The foundation under the tower stair is resisting," he said. "There is older rock beneath it, harder than the rest." Godric turned to the northern end of the hall, where the wall rose against the night in rough, incomplete courses. Gaps still waiting for their windows, one great arch propped on temporary timber. Beyond it stood the base of the tower they had begun first, sunk deep into the mountain where the stone had once been struck by lightning. "Can it be opened?" "Everything can be opened," Salazar said. "The question is what enters when it is." Before Rowena could answer, the fourth thread appeared. It came down without bending, broad as a banner and almost colorless. No frost, no sparks, none of the iron scent of the earlier strands. The stars behind it dimmed as it passed, though the thread itself seemed scarcely brighter than mist. It stopped above the northern wall and hung there, over the old rock hidden beneath the foundations. Helga raised the bowl of darkened moon milk. The surface stayed still. "It does not see the path," she said. Rowena bent over the astrolabe. Its rings had slowed, and the fine needle that tracked the descending light pointed not upward, but down, straight through the floor. "This strand has crossed something lightless," she said, "a distance between stars where even Celestia has little to gather." With the unicorn rope slung over one shoulder, Godric climbed the northern scaffold. The strange thread did not recoil as he came near. It barely moved at all, a pale absence hanging in the air. He put out a hand towards it, and the warmth left his fingers a full foot before he reached it. "Carefully," Helga called from below. His fingertips touched the colorless strand, and the great hall vanished. There was no falling, no darkness, only an immeasurable stillness in which sound had never begun. He could no longer feel the scaffold under his boots or the rope across his shoulder. A single white point appeared far off, then another, so distant one from the other that the gap between them seemed wider than the whole world. Without thinking, he reached towards the nearest. A hand closed around his ankle. Timber, stone, and breath rushed back all at once. He was lying across the scaffold with half his body inside the strand, while Helga clung to his boot from the ladder below. Frost whitened his sleeve and beard. Beside him, the unicorn rope hung loose, untouched by the light. "What did you see?" Rowena asked. He dragged himself back and sat against the beam until the spinning of the hall eased. "Distance." His voice sounded small beneath the open sky. "Too much of it?" Salazar looked up at the pale thread and shook his head. "Then it cannot be carried like the others." The strand began to sink. It passed through the upper stones of the northern wall without making them shine, and wherever it entered, color drained from the granite and left the blocks white and brittle. A carved edge crumbled into powder. The temporary arch creaked as one support gave up its strength. "Close the wall," Godric said. Salazar thrust both hands towards the foundation. Stone folded inward around the descending thread, and still the lightless strand went on through it. A crack split the northern arch from crown to base. Timber bent, iron braces snapped, and a section of unfinished masonry shifted out over the hall. Godric leapt. The unicorn rope caught the falling stones as the arch gave way, and he wrapped the line around the nearest scaffold post and braced both feet against the beam. The weight struck hard enough to jar his teeth. Above him, 6 great blocks hung turning in the air, pale dust pouring from their edges. Helga scrambled onto the platform and pressed both hands to the rope. Moon milk ran from her sleeves into the fibers, cooling the strain before the unicorn hair could scorch through. Below her, Rowena swept every loose chart from the table and spread the blue silk across the floor under the suspended masonry. "Salazar, the old rock," she called. "Do not force the thread away from it. Give it the deepest path. The deepest path leads under the castle. Then let the castle stand over it." Salazar closed his eyes. The pulse beneath the floor changed, and one by one, the channels joining the pillars fell silent as he turned their flow northward. A low grinding rose from below, deeper than the foundations, older than any wall they had raised. Near the broken arch, the flagstones lifted in a long ridge, then parted. Under them lay black mountain rock, split by a narrow natural seam. The colorless thread entered it. For several breaths, nothing moved. Then the seam widened, not by breaking, but by disclosing a depth that had always been there, and the pale strand flowed down into the mountain and carried its immense silence with it. Brittle whiteness faded from the northern wall, though the cracked arch still hung from Godric's rope. Rowena knelt at the edge of the open floor. "It needs emptiness," she said, "a place where no pattern has been imposed." Gray beneath the stone dust, Salazar answered without opening his eyes. "The seam runs below the whole hall. If it spreads, the foundations may divide." Helga looked into the depth. No stars appeared there, yet the darkness no longer felt vacant. It held the colorless thread the way still water holds winter light. "Then do not let it spread alone." She dropped the seed into the seam. The tiny thing vanished without a sound, and for a moment the black rock stayed unchanged. Then a single green-gold filament came down from the southern constellation, passed through the ceiling, ran the length of the nearest pillar, crossed beneath the floor, and entered the mountain after the seed. The lightless strand stirred. A second filament followed, then a third, each carrying the memory of root and branch into the old seam. The pale absence gathered around them and gave space between every line, and what had seemed empty became measure, interval depth, room for one light to remain distinct from another. Across the ceiling, the turning slowed and widened. Stars that had crowded near the southern vault drifted apart. The nameless tree spread its crown without losing shape. Clouds over the western sea gained true distance from the darkness behind them, and the braided band of sky rose higher, though the stone itself never moved. "The sky needed darkness between its lights," Rowena whispered. Salazar guided the old rock closed around the rooted thread, and the seam remained within it, deep and narrow, bearing a quiet current beneath the hall. Above, the 6 suspended blocks settled back into the northern arch one at a time. They did not come home to their old positions. Each turned a little before it rested, opening small spaces between stone and stone through which the true night could be seen. Godric loosened the rope and stepped back. Rougher than before, the repaired arch stood broken by slender gaps, and through those openings, Celestia shone in fine, vertical strokes that joined the living ceiling to the heavens beyond. The mistake had taken away the wall they had planned. In its place stood an arcade of darkness and stars. No one reached to close it. Beyond the new northern arcade, Celestia had begun to lean towards the western mountains. Its crossings burned as bright as ever, though the silver bridges no longer stood directly above the open center of the hall. Light came through the narrow gaps between the reset stones and laid long bars across the floor, and as the living ceiling turned, the bars traveled with it, sliding over chisels, timber, and the blue silk of Rowena's charts. Dawn had not yet touched the east, but the night had entered its later, quieter depth. Rowena counted the open spaces in the arch and added them to her design. The 12 circles she had drawn around the central vault no longer made an even ring. One sat lower, another farther apart, and 3 were joined by the branching line copied from Helga's seed. She studied the altered figure without trying to correct it. The remaining threads must be given room before they arrive, she said. We cannot fill the whole ceiling and expect it to breathe. Salazar rested a hand against the northern wall. Weariness had settled into the set of his shoulders, though the stone under his palm answered him at once. I can open smaller seams between the ribs, he said. They will weaken the span unless the light bears part of the weight. It already does, Godric replied. He stood beneath the braided western band, testing the unicorn rope where several fibers had scorched together, and above him the sky held its curve without beam or mortar, its stars moving in patient measure. We have only refused to trust it. Helga gathered what moon milk remained in the cauldron into 4 shallow vessels. Little of its first whiteness was left. Earth had darkened it. Stone dust had silvered it, and one floating splinter of oak had already put out a tiny shoot. A vessel went at the foot of each central pillar. Then let every part of the hall receive the next light, she said. No single hand should have to carry it. The 5th and 6th threads descended together, approaching from opposite sides of the alignment, one blue and fine, the other red gold, and thick with sparks. The blue strand curled as it fell, looping around itself in smooth coils. The red gold thread came straight down through the air and struck the edge of the central opening in a burst of heat. Stone flashed orange beneath it, and a line of molten crystal ran down the inner curve. Godric caught the blue thread first. It wound round the unicorn rope willingly, then slid past his hand and coiled about his wrist with a cold, almost delicate pressure. The red gold strand would have none of the empty loop he cast towards it. Each time the rope came close, sparks leapt across the gap and burned small black marks into the fibers. It is carrying a young star, Rowena said, one hand raised against the light of the astrolabe as she read it. Too near its birth. Do not cool it suddenly. Beneath the pillars stood 4 bowls, and Helga considered them before she answered that they would warm the path instead. Her wand touched the southern vessel. At once the dark moon milk stirred, and warmth went out through the floor. In a broad circle, ahead of it Salazar opened the lower channels so the heat rose by slow degrees through the western and northern ribs, and the raw stone gave up its night chill. Moisture gathered on the surface until it shone like breath on glass. While Godric kept the rope loose, Rowena guided the blue thread towards the eastern vault. It went into the living ceiling in coils and became a pale spiral of stars, one turning held inside the greater turning. No cloud came to it. It offered back no reflection of land or sea. At its center hung a darkness of perfect roundness, ringed with faint blue fire. Towards that new spiral, the red gold light began to move. For the first time it bent, drawn across the hall by the cooler thread without ever touching it. Sparks came loose from its underside and fell on the scaffolds, and where they fell, they became tiny burning flowers. Helga went beneath them with a wet cloth, lifting each blossom before it could take root in the timber, setting them one after another into a stone bowl. "Closer," Rowena said. "The blue current is taking its heat." Godric cast the rope a second time. Now the red gold strand entered the loop, and the unicorn hair caught fire along its whole length. Heat struck up through his bandaged hand and drove into his chest. He gave ground across the platform, letting the thread run after the curve the blue spiral had already cut. The two lights moved in harmony, and for several moments nothing broke it. Around the dark center, the red gold strand circled, laying a bright ring about it, and the ceiling answered with a deep note, fuller than any it had made before. Every silver instrument on the trestle table lifted half an inch and shivered in sympathy. Between the ribs, Salazar's new seams opened as narrow as knife cuts, and living darkness went into them. Then Godric reached too far. The strand had all but settled when he caught sight of it. One loose arc hanging beyond the western rib, beautiful and unfinished, a curve of fire with no place in the pattern. Rather than let it fall back, he stepped out onto the outermost plank and pulled the rope sharply towards himself. The young Starlight came after him. Its whole weight crossed the western scaffold in one surge. The supporting post split from top to base. The planks dropped away under Godric's boots, and the unfinished span of stone above him lurched inward as its temporary braces gave. What followed came all at once. Salazar turned towards the falling arch. Helga threw both arms up and sent the 4 bowls of moon milk into the air, and Rowena let the astrolabe go and caught its central ring a hand's breadth from the floor. Across the ceiling, the blue spiral tightened about its dark center and dragged the red gold thread with it. Godric fell through a rain of timber and sparks. The unicorn rope was still wound round his arm. As he dropped, the captured strand drew a blazing line down after him and tore half the western sky loose from its turning. Stars streamed out of the ceiling. Clouds folded down into the hall. The braided band bent and bent until its center cracked with a sound like ice breaking clean across a lake. Helga's moon milk reached him first. 4 dark ribbons crossed beneath his body and held him above the flagstones. He came down on them hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs, then rolled into a pool of warm silver. Above, the broken scaffold was still coming down, but Salazar thrust both hands out and turned the stone floor to a deep bed of sand, and timber and blocks sank into it with heavy, muffled thuds. The red gold thread slipped the rope. It swept round the great hall in one vast burning arc and carried fragments of the enchanted sky in its wake. A cloud passed through a pillar and left it dripping with rain. A cluster of stars struck the northern arcade and scattered out into the true night beyond. As its lights were torn free, the nameless tree simply went from the ceiling. Rowena got slowly to her feet, the astrolabe held against her scorched sleeve. Above her, half the vault had gone dark. Godric pushed himself up onto one elbow, blood running from his temple into the moon milk, a thin red thread drawn through the silver. He looked to the broken western span, then to the burning strand circling out beyond their reach. No one spoke his name. Outside the northern arcade, the scattered stars drifted over the unfinished castle like a flock that had forgotten the shape of home. For several breaths, the great hall held nothing but the sound of settling sand. Broken timber leaned from the western scaffold, half buried where Salazar had softened the floor beneath it. From the cloud caught inside the pillar, the rain kept falling, running over unfinished carvings, gathering in silver pools among the tools. Above, the surviving half of the enchanted ceiling turned unevenly, its stars dragging at the torn edges of darkness, while beyond the northern arcade, the escaped lights moved farther out into the open castle. With Helga's hand beneath his arm, Godric rose from the moon milk. His right leg shook when he put weight on it, though the bone held and the cut at his temple had already begun to sting in the cold air. He looked up at the damage he had made and opened his mouth, but Rowena spoke before he could. "The pattern is not lost," she said. Her voice came quiet and exact. She was standing beneath the central opening, the scorched astrolabe held in both hands, watching its bent rings struggle to close their revolutions. One silver arm had fused against the brass. The needle that followed Celestia turned and turned without finding north. She set the instrument on the floor and pressed the warped metal flat with her palm. The eastern turn continued, she told them, and the lower channel still carried it. What they had lost were the joins. Salazar crossed the sand to the western pillar. One sleeve had torn from wrist to elbow, laying bare a long graze white with stone dust. He set his hand against the cracked span and listened before he said that the rib had split through its center, and that if they forced it back into the old curve, the whole western vault might follow. "Then do not force it back," Helga answered. She had let go of Godric's arm and was kneeling now beside one of the rain pools where 3 fallen stars drifted like seeds in black water. Each gave off a faint warmth, and wherever one touched the flagstone, a tiny reflection of cloud appeared beneath it. She cupped her hands around the pool without closing them. They were not trying to flee, she said. They were trying to find the rest. Outside, the scattered lights had entered the unfinished cloister. They passed between roofless arches and over walls still open to the hills, pausing wherever the darkness gathered deeply enough to take them in. One settled inside an empty window and turned the raw stone frame into a view of a night sea. Another drifted down a corridor and left constellations shining in the mortar behind it. Above them all, the red gold thread circled, too bright to touch, drawing them on through the castle. Godric unwound the unicorn rope from his arm. Several fibers had burned away, and what was left of the braid hung loose and blackened in places. "It followed him when he pulled," he said. "If he went after it?" "No," Rowena said. There was no anger in the word. She lifted her eyes from the broken astrolabe and looked straight at him. It had followed the violence of the movement, she said. Another pursuit would only give it more of the same. He lowered the rope. Salazar pressed harder against the pillar, and a line of silver showed inside the crack. weak but unbroken. The escaped strand was still joined to the lower channels, he told them, barely drawing through them as it moved. Then the castle is already holding its path, Helga replied. She dipped one finger into the rain pool, and the 3 fallen stars gathered around it. They needed only to make the path feel larger than the open sky. Rowena turned towards the northern arcade. Beyond its slender gaps, Celestia lay bright over the unfinished towers, though its center had traveled well west of the hall. Darkness had coaxed the first spark back, she said, but this thread carried heat, memory, and half their sealing, and it would not return to emptiness alone. What else did it answer? Salazar asked. Godric looked at the burning flowers Helga had saved in the stone bowl. Their petals had folded shut, and still a red light pulsed inside them. Near it, the seed she had dropped into the mountain seam had sent one pale root up through a crack in the floor, and rain was gathering on its tip. It answered the blue spiral, he said. Rowena lifted her eyes to what remained of the eastern sky. The pale spiral still turned there, wounded but steady. Around its round, dark center, its outer lights had loosened after the rupture, and one arm now trailed towards the western break. Not cooling the red thread, she said, giving it something to circle. Helga rose with the pool of stars cupped in her hands. Then let us make the whole hall its center. They began with the damage. Rather than close the broken western rib, Salazar widened it, and under his hands the central crack opened into a branching seam that followed the true fracture through the stone. Up on the remaining scaffold, Godric cleared away the splintered braces, leaving the wounded span free to bear its own altered shape. Across every surviving section of ceiling, Rowena drew the blue spiral, extending its turn down through the channels beneath the floor, while Helga set the fallen stars at the mouths of the new seams where they sank into the stone and began to glow. The hall changed around the absence. Dark channels spread from the eastern ceiling through pillars, floor, and western arch, joining every empty place into one vast curve, and the broken vault no longer looked like a piece torn away. It became instead an opening within the enchantment, a deep center around which the remaining stars could move. Even the rain cloud caught in the pillar slipped free and began to travel slowly along that wider path. Rowena laid both hands upon the astrolabe. The fused rings resisted her, then gave with a high silver cry, and she bent them outwards, breaking the old instrument's perfect circles. Each ring became an open arc. When she set them spinning again, they no longer turned around one fixed pin, they traveled around the space between them. Across the castle, the escaped stars stopped. The red gold thread passed over the cloister and bent towards the great hall, its fire reflected in every unfinished window, making the raw walls shine as if dawn had come too early. One by one, the scattered lights turned with it. On the broken western rib, Godric stood with the rope loose in his hands. He did not cast it. Instead, he lowered one end into the open seam Salazar had made and let the unicorn fibers unplate themselves through the stone, and the other end he laid across the trailing arm of the blue spiral. A single note passed through the hall. It began in the eastern ceiling, ran down every pillar, crossed beneath the floor, and rose again through the broken west. Outside, the red gold thread answered with a deeper tone. The two sounds met in the open center of the enchantment and went on turning around each other. The living fire came back. It entered first through the northern arcade, drawing a line of red gold light between the narrow stones, and behind it drifted the scattered stars, the sea window, the corridor constellations, and every piece of sky it had carried away. Nothing rushed. Each fragment followed the turning now established within the hall. Helga opened her hands, and the 3 warm stars rose from her palms to join the returning stream. Salazar guided the current through the widened fracture. By degrees, Rowena turned the broken astrolabe, giving each light a place in motion without fixing where it must remain, and Godric held the rope only where it touched the stone, feeling the red gold weight pass through him and continue on. The escaped thread reached the western vault. It did not restore the ceiling they had made before. Fire flowed along the crack, outlining every broken edge, and the lost stars settled around that bright wound in broad sweeping arcs. Clouds came in after them, some carrying rain, others pale with distant snow. Last of all, the nameless tree returned, no longer standing alone. Its roots spread through the fracture, while its crown curved around the open darkness at the center. When the final spark crossed into place, the great hall gave a long, low breath. Godric looked up from the scaffold. Above them, the mistake remained visible, a river of red gold light running through the western night, and around it the whole enchanted sky turned more freely than before, each star held within the movement of the rest. Far beyond the open walls, the first faint graying had begun at the lowest edge of the east. That pale line was still no wider than a blade laid along the mountains. It brought no urgency into the hall, only a change in the quality of the darkness. Celestia's silver bridges had begun to thin at their outer edges, while the living ceiling below held its deeper colors. Red gold fire moved through the western fracture, blue spirals turned in the east, and clouds crossed between them with the slow confidence of weather over open country. The great hall no longer looked roofless. Beneath the altered astrolabe, Rowena watched the movement complete its first full circuit, each open arc traveling around the space between the others, never touching, never repeating quite the same relation. The turning is stable, she said, but it still depends upon Celestia. Salazar lifted his hand from the western pillar. Wherever the silver alignment no longer shone directly above the castle, the stone's pulse had grown faint. The upper channels are borrowing strength from the threads outside, he said. When the crossing passes beyond the mountains, the ceiling may begin to dim. Godric looked up at the open center through which the true stars traveled west, while their living counterparts moved below in a wider, slower rhythm. Until that moment, he had thought of the remaining work as completion. Another strand caught, another span joined, another wound made beautiful. Now he saw the enchantment still reaching beyond itself for support. Helga carried the 4 emptied vessels to the center of the floor and arranged them around the astrolabe. A trace of dark moon milk remained in each, mixed with earth, rain, ash, and powdered stone. "We have taught it how to move," she said. "We have not yet taught it where to draw breath." Rowena turned one of the open silver arcs. The sky draws from distance. The castle has distance within it now, Salazar said. He glanced towards the mountain seam beneath the northern foundation, then towards the winding channels and the pillars. Deep rock, hollow courses, unopened rooms. It could carry the turn far beyond this hall. Godric stepped down from the scaffold and crossed the floor. As the work slowed, every ache in his body came clearer. The burn beneath his bandage, the cut at his temple, the bruising along one side where the moon milk had caught him. He laid the blackened unicorn rope beside the 4 bowls. And what will bring it back? Helga knelt and touched the flagstones. Everything that enters the castle. At her word, the 4 vessels tipped, their remnants running into the joints between the stones, 4 dark streams traveling north, south, east, and west. Salazar opened the lower channels to receive them. The mixture carried warmth from hands, grit from mortar, rain from the escaped cloud, blood from Godric's temple, and 1 green shoot from the timber spark. And as it entered the foundations, the hall filled with the scent of wet earth after frost. Rowena raised the astrolabe above the crossing streams, and the living ceiling responded. Its stars dimmed by a fraction, then brightened as though drawing from somewhere nearer than the heavens. A pulse traveled down the pillars, crossed beneath the floor, and returned through the vault. The movement overhead gained weight and softness. "It is taking the castle into itself," Rowena said. Throughout the unfinished corridors, doors shifted. Their sounds came faintly from beyond the hall, stone hinges grinding, oak frames settling, iron latches lifting where no doors had yet been hung. High in the eastern tower, a bell-shaped opening caught the wind and sent a low note through the masonry, and water stirred in the new well beneath the courtyard. Every chamber offered a small measure of darkness, air, echo, or stone, and the enchanted sky received them through the channel Salazar had made. The ceiling widened without changing shape. Godric could see more within it now, the black shine of locks beyond the hills, the long cloud banks over the sea, snow lying upon summits too distant to name. Yet none of those images held still. They entered, moved, and passed, joining the stars in the same living circulation. A final thread of Celestia descended through the central opening, finer than hair and colorless at first, visible only where it crossed a star. Rowena did not reach for her glass rod. Salazar left the channels unchanged. Helga stayed kneeling with her palms upon the floor, and Godric let the unicorn rope lie where it had been placed. The thread lowered itself. Godric climbed to the western scaffold one last time, and the frost-slick rungs bit into the burn beneath his bandage until he set his jaw and kept going. From up here, the whole hall lay open below him, its crooked geometry laid bare. The tilted scaffolds, the covered silk at the center, the 3 founders moving quietly through the wreck of the night's work like people tidying after a long fever, had broken. The plank that sang was still where he had laid it, bridging the broken western span. He crouched over it and pressed his ear close. Faint and steady, the low pulse ran up through the wood and along the fracture overhead, where the river of red gold light traced the damage into a bright seam among the stars. He had meant to prise the fused planks free and haul them down. Now he left them. Whatever had crossed this scaffold in the night had made the wood into something else, and it was not his to unmake. Below, Rowena turned a slow circle beneath the vault. Her face lifted. The astrolabe went on turning on the folded silk, arc through open arc, and each time one swung across the eastern quarter, the ceiling brightened by a hair, as if answering a question no one had asked aloud. "It keeps the eastern quarter," she said, "more to the vault than to any of them." Salazar did not look up from the northern arcade. His fingers moved from pillar to pillar, waiting on the pulse that rose through the mountain seam and climbed into the vault without a stumble. "It keeps everything," he said. "That is the trouble with it. It forgets nothing we did to it." At the last pillar, he found the narrow gap where an ordinary gray dawn had begun to show through, thinner and colder than the living dark overhead. He brushed the loose dust from its edge with the side of his thumb and let the opening stand, one more crooked thing the roof had chosen to keep. Helga worked her way along the 4 central vessels, coaxing out what little the night had spared. Darkened moon milk skinned the bottom of one, 2 small stars caught and held on its surface. In the next lay 3 grains of crystal salt and a single curled red petal from the burning flowers. The husk of the tiny seed floated empty, and the third split clean down one side where the root had pushed through and gone. She tipped each remnant into the seam between 2 flagstones, patient about it, and the stone took them down without leaving so much as a stain. The broken span held his weight, though the planks beneath his boots sang faintly with each step. Above him, the red-gold fracture crossed the living sky from north to south, gentler now, yet brighter than every star it hung among. He came to the place where he had pulled too hard and laid his bandaged hand against the stone. Warmth moved through the rib, entered his palm, went on past him into the turning ceiling. The first true ray of dawn touched the highest tower. Light ran down the new stonework, finding unfinished edges, empty windows, pale seams of mortar. It crossed the courtyard, came in through the northern arcade, and laid a narrow golden path along the floor of the great hall. Dust rose inside it, each grain bright enough to seem a small world hung in the air. Where the path reached the center, it passed beneath the astrolabe without troubling its motion. Overhead, night began to change. The western stars dimmed into a blue so deep it still carried their shapes, and clouds above the distant sea took on silver rims, while the nameless tree constellation thinned among them like branches glimpsed through mist. In the east, darkness softened from indigo to violet, then to a clear, pale blue. The ceiling did not put out the night. It let the morning pass through. Rowena lifted her face, and a range of mountains rose across the enchanted vault, matching the peaks beyond the open wall in every fold of snow and shadow. Dawn touched the real summits first. A heartbeat later, gold spread across their living image overhead, running ridge to ridge until the whole ceiling seemed to open above a world newly made. Then the castle answered the light. Water in the courtyard, well flashed gold. The frost constellations along the corridor arches melted into clear drops. High in the eastern tower, the bell-shaped opening let go one low note that traveled through every unfinished chamber. Within the great hall, the red flowers set into the mortar opened their luminous petals towards the false sun. Godric came down the span without once taking his eyes from the vault. Salazar left the northern wall and crossed to the central pillars. Helga set down her empty vessels. Rowena let the astrolabe complete a final revolution before its arcs slowed into stillness. No one spoke. Across the finished ceiling, dawn poured over cloud and mountain and the last retreating stars. Its light found the four founders where they stood, amid broken scaffolds and stone dust, then went on through the living sky above them. The founders left no account of Celestia. Wonders are rarely written down by people too tired and too astonished to hold a quill. But the ceiling remembers. On any evening in any weather, it still shows the sky those four hands reached up and caught. The first and last time the heavens were ever persuaded to stay.